This presentation is brought to you by the International Sportsmen's Exposition, the West's largest fishing, hunting, camping, and outdoor sports show, celebrating its 31st season. And by Ultimate Bass Radio with Kent Brown, Sports 1140 AM KHTK.
This guy up here on the aquarium demonstration tank, folks, has won 4 BASS tournaments on the same body of water. He's the only guy in the country that has ever done that. He won all 4 of the first 4 BASS events that came to the California Delta. He won there when the Top 150 Tour stopped there a couple of years ago, when the guys all showed up in downtown Stockton, and he blew them away then. He's one of the top fishermen on the Delta. Robert has been to the Bassmasters Classic now, what, 3 times?
2 times.
2 times. 2-time Bassmasters Classic qualifier. He had a great classic when he was back there in Louisiana, because a lot of his Delta stuff from here, back there. He's a regular competitor on the BASS Elite Series. He'll also be fishing the String Series with us this year as well out here. Always one of the guys to beat on the California Delta. Please welcome the only guy to ever win 4 tournaments on one body of water. Awesome fisherman from Angel Camp, California. Please welcome Mr. Robert Lee.
A lot of it was luck, though.
What?
So a lot of it was luck. I'm not that good.
You're not that good?
No.
I always thought you were.
This thing's falling off. Anyway, hold on a sec. What I'm going to talk to you guys about today is basically just the general techniques on how to fish the Delta, how to go about looking at the map, the tides, bait selection, and pattern fishing on the Delta. The Delta can be real... watch where I'm casting. The Delta can be real confusing. I know it used to confuse me the first few times I went there, just out of college in 1993. I'd go there and all the tules and the canals, and it was real intimidating how much water was there and how many rivers were there and how to get around. And I knew a lot of big tournaments were going to be coming up there, so what I decided to do was to pick an area of the Delta, and basically I picked the area that was closest to my house. So I picked an area of the Delta, and I went there, and I just launched my boat there, and I never ran around a lot. I just fished that area of the Delta, and throughout all the different tide cycles, and learned what the fish did on different tides in that particular area. And then after that, I was able to go to other areas, apply those same techniques, and catch fish throughout the whole Delta that way. So in general, let's pick a tide situation that is probably one of my favorites. It'd be high tide in the morning, and it goes down to about low tide around, say, 1, and then starts coming in. Those are the best days, when you have 2 tide changes in one day, a high to low and a low to high. That way you get 2 different tide changes, which are basically the best times of the day to fish on the Delta. Time of day isn't as critical as tides. So when the tide changes, that's one of the best times to fish your best areas. So in the morning, if we have a high tide and the water just starts to go out, that's a real good time to fish with reaction baits, top waters, even flipping. It depends on the time of the year and the structure you're fishing. For example, this time of the year, a high tide, I'm going to probably pick rock banks with a deeper running crankbait, something I can bounce off the wood, a black and blue jig. I'm going to probably target rock banks with wood, rock banks with small amounts of weeds, because they usually have a little more depth on them for this time of the year, and rock banks that have wood on them. The fish on the rock banks are easier to catch on a high tide because they usually get on the inside edge of the weeds, or they'll move up and down the rocks. And to move up and down in the rocks, it's a real short distance to go shallow and deep. So I like to fish on a high tide, a rock bank with different types of cover. And my first choice is something like this, a deep diving crankbait that can get down to 5 to 7 feet. I want my crankbait to get down and bump the cover and rip through the weeds or bounce off a stump like that. That's what makes the fish try to bite it. Instead of a crankbait that only runs 2 to 3 feet, a lot of times your crankbait or rattle trap will go over top of all the cover, and you won't touch it. And touching the cover is one of the ways to make a bite down there. The bigger fish will hit. It's more of a reaction type, reaction type bite. And even if I'm not ticking the weeds or bouncing it off a piece of cover, I'll bury my retrieve. This bait ain't running too good, but I'll reel it fast, and then I'll slow it down, and then I'll reel it fast again, and then slow it down. Try to get a fish to chase it, and then when it stops, it's in their face, and they'll grab it. Another thing to do on the high tide is to flip the isolated cover along those rock banks. When I'm talking about isolated cover, I'm talking about a tule clump or a tule run, stumps, larger rocks. A lot of the best rocks at the delta, the best rocks down at the delta are not the new rocks that they've put in just recently with the dredges. The best rocks are usually the rocks that have been there a long time. They're usually a little bigger. They'll have rebar in them, maybe some old wood. They're just older. They'll hold more crawfish, and they're better rocks. So target some of that kind of stuff, and I'll basically just flip that cover. You can go pretty fast. You want to bounce your bait off of the cover, try to make the fish hit it with a reaction. And a lot of guys will fish their bait when they flip it into a prime spot. Say there's a log on a rock bank, and they'll flip it in there by there, and they'll just go hop, hop, and pull it out, and then make another pitch. What I like to do, if I know there's a fish there, if I feel there's a fish there, I'll put it in there right next to the piece of cover, and I'll just let it sit for quite a while, and then I'll just shake it in one spot, and then shake it in one spot, and pick it up, and shake it in one spot, and leave it there for a while, especially this time of the year, to let the fish will know, they'll know it's there, but it takes them a while to get a hold of it. A lot of guys will pitch in by that stump there and go hop, hop, and then they'll pull it in and flip it out there again. And it's better to leave it in there for a little while. Give the fish a chance to eat it, especially when the water is cold. As the tide starts to go out, the fish change. The ones at the delta, the bigger fish, will move from the inside edge of the grass line to the outside edge of the grass line, or deeper cover. So as the tide falls, I'll fish those same areas that I was fishing on the high tide. I won't run the Frank's Track to Dell's Island to upriver. I like to stay in an area, and I pick an area that's got good deep water, wood, tules, weeds, rocks, islands, everything. That way, as the tide goes down or goes up, you can adjust from flipping to cranking or to top water, and you can adjust from your type of cover, wood, weeds, tules, rocks, islands, all within the same area, and it just makes you a more efficient fisherman throughout the day. So as the tide starts to go out, the fish will go in from transition from being shallower to deeper. Fish, they don't want to get caught in no water, so that it's a natural thing for a fish to move deeper. Also, as the tide goes out, a lot of the fish that didn't move up become exposed. Now you're able to fish them, or see at least where they're hiding. So what I like to do is I like to go down the rock banks, the islands, and what I'll do is on the lower tide, as it gets lower, lower, and lower, I'll look for areas that are furthest from the bank, that make a direct point, and I'll fish that point. I'll flip or crank the edge of that outside grass, just into the grass about that far, and then I'll pull it out and let it go down off the edge and try to determine whether they're in the grass or just out of the grass. And then I'll crank across those deeper outside points. And the best crank points will have smaller weeds in 7-8 feet of water out in front of the bigger mat. From there, I'll find channel bends that swing in towards the rocks or swing in towards the sides of islands. Anything to get a little bit of deeper water closer to the bank. When you can find deeper water closer to the bank, especially if there's a big flat of weeds, a big bunch of shallow water with a lot of weeds close to it, is a prime spot, because those fish will use all those shallow weeds on a flat at high tide. And then as the tide recedes, the fish will pull off that flat and get right into that nice little deep spot close to the bank or just out off the shore a little bit, and it sets them up real good. The only problem is with the low tide is a lot of times the current goes in the same direction for like 5 hours. Okay, and the fish will you might catch some fish at the first part of the outgoing because the tide switched and they'll get a little active. But then after 4 or 5 hours of the current going in the same direction, the fish will move out a little deeper and get in those spots I'm talking about, but you won't be able to catch them very good because of the fact that the tide has gone the same direction so long, they've gotten accustomed to the tide being in that direction, and they just become dormant, sluggish. So what you want to do is, if you know the fish are in the area, it's a good looking deep spot, you've gotten bit in practice, say, or you've caught fish there in the past, go back there when the tide just starts to come in. The best tide on the Delta, in my opinion, for everything except topwater fishing, it's the first hour and a half of the incoming tide. In that situation, the fish are in their deep spots. All the cover is visible. You can see the outside weed lines. You can see the stumps. You can see everything. And you can tell where the fish are going to be. And when that tide turns around and starts going the other direction, the fish have to reposition because they have to face up current. And when they reposition and get on the other side of the point, another side of the log, the other side of a rock, whatever the other side of it is, they're going to be active because they got to move. And that normally triggers them into biting, or at least making them to be able to react to something. And that's real key. I see guys, they got to run, and they'll get off the tide, say they'll fish a stretch of bank. Well, man, I had some good fish here in practice or this area, and they just hit it on the low tide and left and went somewhere else and never came back. I always come back to my best water on the tide switch, even if I never caught any fish there earlier in the day or the day before, just because of the fact I know they're there, and if the tide turns and I didn't hit it on the right tide, and I hit it on the right tide the following day or later that day, you can catch at least one nice fish and hopefully 2 or 3. This is how critical the Delta is. For example, the last Bassmaster tournament that I won, it was the tour event. I fished the same areas the first 2 days, but I was kind of on a pre-spawn pattern. When I realized the fish were spawning, I started fishing that stuff on the lower tide because I could see the holes in the weeds and all that kind of business. I could see right where they were spawning. But what I did was, the next 2 days, I seen fish swim off. The fish I was catching were barely hooked. They chased my bait out of the water, and I couldn't catch them. So the next 2 days, I decided I was on the wrong tide. I went back to those same places that I couldn't really catch anything on the low tide. I went back there on the high tide. Granted, you couldn't see the holes where the fish were at. You couldn't see the little sticks they were swimming around. But the fish were there, and they were aggressive. They had a little more water on top of them. They were trying to spawn, and they wouldn't swim away, and they weren't scared. What you do in that situation, this is usually later in the spring, in March, end of March, beginning of April, even towards May. There's a lot of guys on that situation, as the tide gets high, they'll flip real tight to everything that's on the bank. What I'm saying is, on the low tide, that stuff is out of the water. What you want to try to flip on a high tide is the stuff that's in the water on low tide, just barely. You can't really see it. You have to have kind of a visual picture of where it is. Remember, I guess you could GPS it or write it down. But instead of flipping up now I'm snagged. Real tight up by that light, that's going to be out of the water on low tide. The guy just wants to flip right in there. And a lot of the fish that a guy catches on the high tide flipping is exactly where everybody else's boat goes down the bank. All you have to do is move your boat out one boat width, and I call it blind flipping. I don't even flip at targets. I flip like 4 feet apart. It's like this, at 4 feet, and it'll eventually, usually those fish are pretty aggressive, and they'll move 2 or 3 feet to get the bait. And it's a real good technique down there on a high tide flip situation, where the tide starts coming in. After you've located the areas on the low tide, you can fish them that way on the high tide and do a lot better. This time of the year, the Delta can be real tricky. I mean, I've done real good in, actually I don't know if I've ever fished there in January, but I fished there a lot in February. And in February, what a guy wants to look for, because the season's just going to start kicking up down there, I like to try to concentrate on a lower tide, of course, because we've had so much rain, so much water coming in. I try to fish it on the, that's the only time of year I'll try to run tides a little bit, is in February. I'll try to keep on a lower tide water level. I'll try to fish areas that are a little more stained, because I believe that stained water warms up a little quicker. And the stained water also helps the fish remain shallow, even in cold water, and lets them hang on objects such as a stick or a clump of tules and things like that. So I want to try to stay on a lower tide, fish a little stained water, fish targets on islands and rocks, fish the deep spots. Usually the best places on the rocks or the berms are where the channel swings into it, so they got deep water right next to the bank. That cover in that area will be good. And my number one bait I like to flip is this large tube and a black and blue jig. And if the bite's real good, I always start with a jig, and then as I don't get bit or I'm missing some fish, I'll switch to the tube. And then, of course, I'll go to a zipper worm also. But the flipping this time of year on them type of banks are real good. And then the second thing that I like to do this time of year and going into March is this crankbait. Even though the water, I don't know what the temperature is down there, I haven't been down there, but I assume it's 48, 52, something like that. What I like to do down there this time of year is this a little bit of wrong color, but I'll pick them same stretches of bank where the fish are, and I'll throw a crankbait. You'll be amazed on how many fish will not eat a gitsit or a jig or a zipper worm, but that rattling crankbait right there, reeling it faster, moving it, bouncing it through the logs, digging it into the rocks, ripping it out of the grass, even though it's moving faster, the fish will react. I normally use reaction type colors. This is a kind of a natural color here, which is better later in the year. But the best color that I like to use this time of the year is chartreuse and black. They'll have it with an orange belly. You get a little orange belly, chartreuse with a black back, and for some reason that color, when the water's cold, makes the fish react. Or a chrome and blue. I don't know what it is about cold water and chrome, even though I believe that most of the fish in the Delta eat crawdads and bluegill. Chrome is a good reaction color. A good reaction color in cold water. Now on my snag. Oh, I can't see the stump down there. And other than that, I mean, I might try a slow roll spinner bait, but I usually try cranking and flipping, and if I can't catch them on that, I usually go to a different area or try to figure out a different tide scenario on different types of water. I'm going to lose that thing. It'll float up, watch. You know, fish is going to eat it. It'll go down there. Bear with me 1 minute here. There it is. I guess I can't crank anymore. Anyway, as it gets a little later in the year, towards the pre-spawn, which is usually around the Valentine's Day, or not Valentine's, like the fourth week of February through the end of March. The number one thing to do on the Delta is flipping. Those big fish are starting to move shallow, and they'll look for crawdads and bluegill. I mean, I know I keep emphasizing the flipping, but there's been more tournaments on the Delta 1 flipping than any other technique. So the Delta is all about figuring out the tides, the patterns, and the percentages. And why would I want to waste my time throwing a white chartreuse spinnerbait that catches 2-pounders when I can be flipping all day and have a chance on every flip to catch an 8-pounder? So I figure you'll catch 2-pounders in the process anyway, so I try to stick with the percentages. As the water gets warmer and the tide where the weather gets a little warmer, the water gets warmer, and the fish start to go into a pre-spawn, the fish go onto a huge movement. They usually start moving back towards the ends of things. They'll move from the river, not the river, but like in between the river and the ends. They kind of winter in the midsection. They'll start making a big migration towards the backs of things. The water starts to get warmer back there. It's a little clearer. The fish are on the move. A lot of the bluegill will start getting active in the backs of those types of areas. And the water's a little clearer. A lot of different things. The fish are also maybe thinking about spawning. So I'll start targeting more further towards the back in the March time of the year. Uh-oh, I got one. Towards March and April. And fish the backs of the dead ends, and I really like to flip every little piece of cover, and numerous times. Like, for example, that fish there, I know he's in a tank and he's probably pretty stupid, but you know, I had to flip in there 25 times, and then he finally ate it. You know, it's the same thing in the wild. A lot of times you have to pick a good area, a nice piece of, there you go, a nice piece of cover, and make multiple casts at the same spot. And it's amazing. I catch a lot of fish that way, and it's amazing how many guys have gone through there just dropping in one time. If you sit there and make 5 casts at that one stick and don't get bitten, then maybe give up on it. But make repeated casts. And sometimes all it takes is a little bit different angle, or maybe even a different bait, you know, and it really helps a lot. Then as we get towards later in the year, in the summer, I really like to fish the heavy weeds in the late spring, post-spawn. And that's when I didn't bring any today, but that's because you can't see them too good in the tank. That's when I like to switch to top water. Once it hits May, I'll usually throw a top water 99% of the time, whether it's a Zara spook, a frog, or a Rico. And if I need to fill my limit, I'll do that crank pattern I was telling you about. And it's just sticking with that type of that year. Those type of baits usually generate the bigger strikes. So I'm gonna stick with that kind of stuff. Let's see. Yeah, tides, I mean, you could go on about them forever. And I've seen a lot of different tide scenarios work out that are odd, and I've seen them be textbook. But normally the fish change on like a 3-day cycle. I mean, they'll be on a great flip bite on an incoming tide, a certain type of pattern, this or that. But as 3 days goes by, that tide goes later and later and later into the day, whether it's in the afternoon or into the mid-morning. And those fish will start to change and start using different types of patterns, because that low tide or that high tide is at different times of the day, and the fish will go with the cycles with the time of day and moon and whatever also. So you always have to keep adjusting your patterns, the delta, from day to day to day. That's why the delta, if you look at the standings, it's always the same guys catch all the fish. It's because they understand the movements and the patterns, or they fish there a lot and are able to keep up with the patterns and the movements at all times. I mean, it's hard for a guy to go down to the delta and without any practice and just start catching fish unless you've done it before. So the delta is one of those places you really got to put some effort into. You really got to spend some time, figure out the tides, figure out the baits, the patterns, and then be willing to be able to adjust and switch that during the fishing day, or on a series of 2 or 3 days, be able to keep up and adjust, because the delta is such a good fishery. You know, just catching 25 pounds one day on a 2 or 3 day event, you have to catch it every day, or you're going to lose. And even fishing out for fun, a guy wants to catch as much as he can every day he goes out. So don't be bullheaded and do what you caught him on last week. You know, be ready to change, try different patterns, different areas of the delta, different water colors, water temperatures, and patterns according to the tide. I know it sounds like a lot, but once you get to start doing it, it gets pretty easy. Anyway, that's all I have. That's basically a delta crash course, real fast. There's, like I said before, there's a lot of other things. that can work and do work. So right now, if anybody has any questions, I can answer any, or I'll be down here, and you can ask me one-on-one too. Okay then. Feel free to ask me if you have any questions. I'll be right down here or over at the Galaxy booth, and that'll cover it.